Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another online talk hosted by the Lahore Literary Festival. My name is Iman, and I'm delighted to be in conversation here today with none other than Professor Stephen Dale. He is a historian and a professor at The Ohio State University. He has previously taught at the universities of Chicago and Minnesota. His interests include Islamic history, history of empire, and religion in history. He has written three books, including The Muslim Empires of Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals, The Orange Trees of Marrakesh, Babur, Timurid Prince, and Mughal Emperor, 1483 and 1530, which will be a focal point of our discussion today. He's actually joining us here today from Portland, Oregon, and he's here for the first time with the LLF. So a very warm welcome to you, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, good evening. It's wonderful to talk to you.
I hope it's not too early for you. It's your 9 a.m. in Portland.
No, not at all.
Okay. So I was thinking before we fully delve into the rich life history of Zahiruddin Babur, the Timurid Mughal emperor and founder of the earliest, one of the earliest Muslim dynasties and empires, it's imperative that we sort of set the scene and describe what the world was like back in the day. So could you, in a few words, describe the geographical dynamics as well as the socio-cultural climate of the time and who was ruling where? So in terms of Central Asia and the Hindustan Gazetteer.
It's a complicated mess in the 15th century. So he was born, of course, in 1483 in a town in the Ferghana Valley. The Ferghana Valley is the easternmost part of the current state of Uzbekistan, and it borders on China to the east. And the Ferghana Valley has been settled, agricultural settlement going all the way back to the 2nd century BC. So it was an agrarian settlement, which was described actually by a Chinese traveler in the 2nd century BC. And it's also one of the routes of the famous Silk Road going from China to the west. Much of the trade went through the Ferghana Valley to Samarkand and then south to India and onwards to the Middle East. So at the time he was born, the politics were really chaotic. His family was, of course, descended from Timur, or Tamerlane. And there were a number of people who were struggling for power in this area in Central Asia at the time he was born. There were his own relatives, none of whom cooperated with each other and all of whom struggled with one another for power. And in their attempt to reclaim the mantle of Timur himself. That is to say, there were a number of these descendants of Timur, all of whom were competing for power among themselves. In addition to that, there were two other groups who were involved in these power struggles. One, there were groups of Mongols left over from the times of the Mongol Empire, and there were detachments of Mongol troops in the Ferghana Valley, although the greatest number of Mongols lived in what is now Xinjiang, that is to say, the areas around Kashgar and so forth in what is now part of Western China. Then there was yet another group, that is the ancestors of the Uzbeks, who were increasingly moving into the territories controlled by the Timurids. So at the time that Babur came to power, you might say, when he was 11 and a half years old, when his father died, and he inherited his father's little estate in this Ferghana Valley, there were all these groups competing for power. And for the next 10 years after his father died, so now we're talking 1494, 10 years, about 11 and a half years after he was born, he spent the first 10 years of his life competing for power with these other groups in Central Asia. So there was no central control this time at all. The Timurids the descendants of Timur fought among themselves, then they fought with the Mongols, and they fought with the Mongols, and they fought with the Uzbeks. And gradually what happened, and twice during this period of time, Babur occupied Samarkand, which was Timur's capital. It was a famous ancient city of Central Asia. And he hoped to become the leader of the Timurids, as did all of his relatives. And there was no central cooperation between any of these groups. Eventually what happened, though, is the lack of any kind of cooperation among his own family He was forced out of this area by the Uzbeks, who killed most of his relatives and some of the Mongols who cooperated with him. And Babur was forced out of Central Asia and wound up in Kabul. And the reason he wound up in Kabul eventually because Kabul had been a city which had been controlled by a distant uncle of his until about 2 years before he arrived in 1504. So the Timurids had some reason for he went to Kabul because it really was the only place he could go to get away from the Uzbeks. And so when he arrived there in 1504, he arrived there as a refugee, basically, with some Mongol supporters, a few relatives, but in a very impoverished situation. Gradually, he's able to take over control of the city of Kabul, and then he spent about 20 years in Afghanistan, and attempting to, first of all, he hoped to go back to Central Asia. And in 1511, he made an attempt to reclaim the heritage in Central Asia and took his troops back into Central Asia, briefly to Samarkand, and then was forced out once again by the Uzbeks and was chased back into Afghanistan and wound up back in Kabul. And from this period of time, this is about 1514, 1515, eventually it became clear to him that the only possibility of having a stable Timurid state was in India. Now, one of the reasons for that, of course, is anybody who knows anything about the history of Afghanistan knows how difficult it is to control the Pashtun tribes there. And he had exactly the same problems that all of the other powers who have tried to control Afghanistan had. That is to say, the Pashtun tribes made it almost impossible for him to govern many of these areas. And in fact, exactly in the area where Osama bin Laden took refuge after the Americans entered Afghanistan, these are one of the areas that Babur himself eventually said was too troublesome to try to maintain control when he could go to some place like India, which was very wealthy and where people were used to paying taxes. So finally, from the period from about 1515 to 1520, he began to carry on a series of expeditions into the Punjab from Kabul, and eventually became allied with some of the Lodi groups who opposed the central regime in Delhi. This is a very, very complicated long-term struggle that was going on, but finally, as you know, in 1525, by 1525, he had largely taken control of Lahore and some parts of Western Punjab, and was cooperating with some of the Lodis who opposed the regime in Delhi. And at that time, then he finally decided to stage a serious invasion of northwestern India with a very small number of troops. That is, his daughter, when she's writing about this at the end of the 16th century, says that he had between 7,000 and 8,000 serviceable troops when he entered India at that time to fight with the Lodis. And then at the Battle of Panipat in April of 1526, he faced a vastly superior Lodi army with his army, but he had very, very effective fighting forces in some of his Mongol relatives. And probably the reason for his victory at Panipat was the effectiveness of his Mongol relatives, plus the fact that he had advisors from the Ottoman Empire, and Babur adopted their technique of fortification of his line. So there are two reasons why he was probably militarily victorious at that time. And one reason also in that the Lodis are very disorganized and fighting amongst themselves. So we have someone spending about the first 20 years of his life in Central Asia, trying to trying to recapture Samarkand and reestablish himself as a Timurid ruler in Samarkand.
Was it a fight for sovereignty or for expansion or control?
Initially, it was
And how to create an empire, or did it just did it just happen?
basically he and all of his relatives who descended from Timur saw themselves as potential leaders of a new Timurid state. And
Oh,
Samarkand was the capital, Timur's capital. They usually fought over Samarkand. And of course, he regarded himself as a legitimate heir of Timur, but of course, so did all of his relatives.
mhm.
But the Uzbeks killed most of his relatives in between 1502 and 1504. So by the time he arrived in Kabul, there were very few Timurid princes left, which was useful for him. So when he was in Afghanistan for 20 years, he spent time trying to establish a kind of control over Eastern Afghanistan. But as I said, it was extremely difficult. And he finally, in his memoirs, basically said, it's a waste of time trying to establish control over this impoverished, fragmented state. It's too much trouble, it takes too much money, and it's too difficult. And so finally, I mean, his expansion in India was to establish a new Timurid state in India, because that was the only place he could do it. It was the last place to go. And he recognized in his memoirs that some people have probably read, he didn't actually like Northern India very much because it was so different from his homeland. You know, the climate was different, the food was different. He said even the rocks are different.
And it
And
had
so,
little appeal.
yes, it had little appeal for him personally, but he said the one thing that appealed to him is it had lots of gold and silver. That is to say, he could establish, saw that he could establish a Timurid state in a very wealthy area where people were, after all, used to paying taxes. And in fact, when he's in Afghanistan, he distinguishes between villages that were villages of the pen and villages of the sword. This distinction meant that villages of the pen were villages that would pay taxes without troops being sent in to beat up the local people. And villages of the sword were villages where you had to send in troops to collect revenue. So he was delighted that when he got to India, that the people there were used to paying the villagers were used to paying revenue. And so then from 1526 until 1530, he spent the time trying to establish control over, you could say, the Doab, really, in India. Basically the area from Punjab down to Delhi and down to Gwalior and the Western Gangetic Valley. Which was itself, of course, extraordinarily difficult because he had a very few troops. The Afghans, there were Afghan forces all over northern India, and of course, various other groups, and particularly the Rajputs in Rajasthan. So the second major battle he fought was with Rana Sanga, the famous Rajput chief. And this was a battle in which he thought he was going to lose. He was afraid he was going to lose. And so this was the only time in which he invoked a kind of Islamic jihadist ideology when he faced Rana Sanga to try to get his troops to cooperate in the battle. It's the only time he really used that ideology because he really thought he was going to lose. Okay. But after that battle, of course, he began to more effectively establish control over those areas. He had kind of control over the Punjab, of Delhi, Agra, and then gradually was able to extend his control down the Gangetic Valley by the time that he died.
Okay. So let's talk a bit more about Babur's personal life, his eccentricities, what he likes. And so there's this, he's written his own autobiography, which is perhaps the most remarkable writing or autobiography in pre-modern history. And perhaps the most authoritative resource available on Babur. And he chronicles his life from childhood to old age. He writes very candidly, so it's a mixture of ghazals, it's a mixture of prose. Can you talk a bit more about his personal life from the lens of his Baburnama? I have it with me here, actually.
Yes, as you said, it's really it's really remarkable, remarkable work. And as you indicated, there's nothing comparable to it, I think, in pre-modern life. I don't think there's anything comparable to it for any ruler at any time in the history that one can think of. I mean, there are other people who wrote memoirs or autobiographies in various parts of the world, in China or the Middle East or Europe, but I don't think there's anything of the richness and depth of Babur's, of the Baburnama, which, by the way, he referred to just as vaguely as events. That is, the Baburnama title is a later title given to this work. The word he used was simply events. And yes, he chronicled his life from the time he was in Uzbekistan through the period he was in Kabul, and then down to the year before he died in Agra. And of course, it's dominated by his desire to present himself as the legitimate defender of, legitimate heir of the Timurids, and his claim to India, that is, the justification he gave for invading India was at one time it had been controlled by Timur, which of course it wasn't. I mean, Timur in 1398 had invaded India and plundered Delhi and carried back a lot of artisans to Central Asia and stolen everything he could. Babur used that as an excuse. I mean, he would have invaded India anyway, but he used that as an excuse to justify his invasion. And so it's important to understand, I think, that this was not an invasion for religious purposes. It was an invasion to establish a Timurid state where he and his family could have a nice time, frankly. Right? I mean, this was a very simple kind of motivation. So
comfortable lifestyle.
Yes, and the focus of I should say that before getting into some other aspects of this, the most important institution for Babur was not the mosque, even though there were 3 mosques built during his lifetime. The most important institution for him was the garden, and these famous gardens that he talks about. And his ideal, really, of a city was Herat under the last ruler of the Timurids, Sultan Hussein Baikara. And he describes when he went to Herat, these wonderful evenings he would have with his cousins when they would sit around drinking a lot, I should say, reciting poetry, listen to music, sometimes planning campaigns. But he repeatedly talks about this as the institution which he loved to have, and which, when he got to India, he looked back to his time in Afghanistan and very nostalgically, because he felt that you couldn't establish the same kind of gardens in India as you had in Afghanistan and Central Asia. It's really important, I think, to understand that. So the society in these gardens was really the most important society for him and for many of his Mughal compatriots. In terms of of course, the autobiography, so it's focused, of course, on his political and military life. But as you said, really the most interesting part of it is the fact that he talks about his personal life. And he has these extraordinarily interesting stories, which you don't find in any other memoir. And certainly in the Islamic world, you never find things like this. Especially his stories about when he got married, and his first wife, he wasn't paying much attention to his young wife. Of course, he was a very young man at the time. And he said, well, my mother, just berated me and sort of nagged me until I went and visited my wife. And so you could tell that this was just kind of something, it's kind of an afterthought in his political campaigns at this time. And then he also describes one time when he's in Andajan, which was his home fortress in the Farghana Valley, how he fell in love with a boy, supposedly.
He writes very candidly about it in his autobiography, actually.
In his memoirs, yes, it's quite remarkable. Of course, this is the boy he hardly ever spoke to. He just supposedly fell in love with him. This is somebody he saw. He hardly ever talked to him, but he did write some really wonderfully awful Persian poetry about falling in love with this boy. And it's a kind of teenage infatuation, and everything he describes is like things you read about how teenagers, when they first fall in love with some girl they've seen at a distance. In this case, it was some boy who happened to be named Baburi, but nonetheless, yes, right, that was actually the name. Yes, his own name. And so these kinds of things you find in his memoirs are just remarkable. Such open and frank discussions of these kinds of things. And the other things, of course, you also find in the memoirs, especially in the period when he's describing life in the Ferghana Valley, is when he lost battles, because his period in the Ferghana Valley, when he was a very young man, very inexperienced, had very little experience in military affairs. He lost several important battles there, and each time he said it was his fault. Now, you never read this in memoirs, right? Especially of successful emperors later on. And so he describes these battles and what he failed to do and why he lost the battles, and essentially attributes his failure to establish a state there to his own incompetence. And it wasn't until he got to Afghanistan and won a battle against some Afghan forces there that he actually began to have some sort of military successes. What's also interesting about the memoirs, of course, is when he gets to Afghanistan, then you have this sort of detailed, he was there for, I mean, most of his adult life he was in Afghanistan. And the Afghans even today look back on him as really kind of an Afghan more than anything else. Many Indians are probably familiar with this. And he has these detailed descriptions of Afghanistan. And so it's interesting from the point of kind of sociology too. And I know you're a sociologist interested in this, that is his descriptions of Afghan society, of the economies of these areas, of the tribes that are involved. He had detailed descriptions, which are really very much like the descriptions you find in the early British gazetteers in India that were written in the 19th century. I think they're equal in their sophistication in terms of the kinds of things he wrote about it, the kind of food that was grown, the money that was provided by these areas, the people who are involved. And of course, during this period of time, when he had a little more security than he had early in his life, he also was married of course, 4 different times, or to various wives, some of whom were marriages of convenience to Afghan tribes. And this was also a period in which he produced the bulk of his poetry.
Right.
And we started talking about this earlier. But one of the other, I think, really compelling aspects of why people find the Babur Nama so interesting is that he really came from this very sophisticated intellectual background. His father was someone who had read Persian poetry, often in Ferghana Valley, even though it seems like in the middle of nowhere, but Persian society and culture was very important in these areas. I mean, Samarkand was a great and sophisticated city. And Babur, from the earliest time in his life, in his memoirs, starts trying to perfect his ability to write good poetry. 90% of it was in Turkish, that is the dialect of Chagatai Turkish, which was his native language. I mean, he did write some really, really bad poetry in Persian, especially when he fell in love with this boy in the bazaar. But most of his poetry is in Turkish, and most of it was written when he was in Kabul. A large numbers of ghazals and rubayats, especially ghazals, which were these long poems, which are really regarded as a sign of competent poets if you could do this very well. And of course, he was copying and learning from the great poets of his past, particularly Jami, who's a famous poet from
Sati as well from the
Herat,
Iran.
yes, and from Neva'i, who was a Turkish poet in Herat also. So he was studying the poems of these men and writing his own poetry, and he was extremely proud of his own poetry. One time when he was in Ferghana, back in his early period, when he was struggling to survive, he visited a Mongol uncle in Tashkent. And he said, well, one of the reasons he wanted to speak to his uncle is he'd had a reputation as a poet. And he found out that actually he was really incompetent as a poet. So in the middle of all these political struggles, he's writing poetry all the time and trying to perfect his poetry. And
I'm going to interrupt you for a second.
Yeah,
Between 1508 and 1518 to 1519, Babur writes nothing. That's the period when we know nothing about Babur. He writes nothing, no. So what happened then as
We
a
don't,
historian? What would
we don't know too much. Yes, that's right. It's good to bring that up. There are large gaps in the Babur Nama in which the text has been lost. It may have been lost when Humayun was chased out of the country afterwards. No one knows for sure. But all of the surviving manuscripts have the same gaps. And right from 1519 to 1525, there's nothing. We know he was fighting to establish his control. And well, first of all, he was from 1514 after he got chased out of Samarkand again by the Uzbeks. There's almost no information from that period, and from 1519 to 1525, there's none from his memoir. We know a little bit about a few things about his campaigns from Persian sources, but not very much really. So it's clearly I think he was still writing poetry at that period of time, and there are poems which may be dated to that period of time, but it's difficult to date these. It's difficult to date these poems. But certainly in 1518 and 1519, before the pages are missing, it's one of the most interesting years because he was relatively secure at that period of time, and he spent a great deal of time in these gardens having drinking sessions with his compatriots and writing and reciting poetry. And he uses a term, subat. This is also a term in Urdu and in Persian, and it's also used in Turkish, which means kind of conversation and so forth. But he refers to these gatherings in these gardens as subat. He talks about subat al-rayalok, the kind of the society of these gardens. And it's really one of them in 1518, 1519 especially. He talks about being drunk a great deal of the time. And so, then he said at the age of 40, he was going to stop drinking. And this is something that many Muslims, they choose this period to stop drinking. But alcohol was an important part of Central Asian culture. And if you read the histories of Timur himself, the Europeans who visited Timur saw how much they drank, which is a great deal. In any case, during that period of time then, when he was in Kabul, he really wrote most of the poetry he's famous for. And he wrote two major collections or diwans of poetry. And he was very proud of these, and he sent them to other members of his family. Most of these are in Turkish, and they have been preserved. And there's a very good edition of them done by a Turkish scholar, if anybody's interested. But something one has to get used to Chagatai Turkish. The language he wrote in Chagatai Turkish is a language which is highly Persianized. That is a lot of vocabulary. It's a little bit like Urdu in a way. That is to say, it's a language which is full of Persian images and Persian vocabulary. So people who come at this from Urdu or from Hindustani find it a little bit easier to deal with. But I should say that the one thing about his poetry, going on to that, what's so interesting about it, in India, he wrote a series of poems, which are rubaiyat, these 4-line poems for which Edward Fitzgerald made famous in the 19th century. These poems he translated into English. The rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, that many people are familiar with. And so when he was in India, he wrote mainly these 4-line poems called rubaiyat. And in those poems, he really expresses his emotions in ways that are not even found in his memoirs. And for Muslim writers, or Muslims generally, where they usually express personal emotion was not in their memoirs so much, although Babur does a great deal of that, but even more so in their poetry. And in his poems, of course, you've probably read some of these. He talks about, among other things, how much he hated North India because he felt, basically he was homesick, tremendously homesick, right? And also he never encountered a kind of caste-like society before. And so he was sort of bewildered by how the society worked. And he several times talks about how while as an own society, people could come and go equally, relatively equally within society, how that was not possible in India. So he criticized India for a
Was he
number of reasons.
was he exposed to Hindus and the Hindu caste system, or were there any Muslims at the time in Delhi? Because when he entered Delhi, he said there's so much dust, and everyone looks the same, and all the cities look the same. It's got little. He didn't like the general sociology or even the topography of the region or the
Right.
area.
He didn't like anything.
But that also brings me to my sort of next question. I
Mhm.
was talking to you about this yesterday as well, and as an educator and also as a historian, we often study or have studied discourse on imperialism and westernization and all of that. And how is it, I mean, now studying Babur and the Mughals and how they were foreigners
Mhm.
especially in South Asia.
Yes.
Um, is it possible? Do you consider the Mughals first of all as invaders, and second of all as a as a sort of a pre-modern brand of imperialism?
This is old-fashioned military imperialism, right? They were certainly invaders, but their target, you remember the target of Babur when he invaded were the Lodis. And of course, the Lodis were Muslim Afghans.
Mhm.
So when he's invading India, his target was not, it was not, I mean, I was talking to you yesterday about being recently in India and talking about Babur. And Babur was often seen either as a barbarian or as a religious fanatic, and he's neither of those things really. He's a very sophisticated Timurid, and it's certainly yes, it's an old-fashioned military invasion. This is back in the days when imperialism could pay. That
Mhm.
is to say, when you could make money from imperialism, unlike the American invasion of Iraq, where you could lose money, never mind killing hundreds of thousands of people in the process. So in the early 16th century, an invasion of India could be very profitable, just as it was when the Ghaznavids did it in the 10th and 11th century, or when the Delhi Sultans did it between 1206 and 1398, right? So this is just another one of these invasions, which goes all the way back to the earliest period of Indian history, because in comparison with, it's really important to understand, I mean, in comparison with Afghanistan and Central Asia, the population of Afghanistan and Central Asia at the time he invaded um, India was probably no more than 1 million people,
Mhm.
maybe not even that. And he himself said when he talked about the revenues, for example, of the areas around Kabul, the revenue of Agra itself was about 10 times what the revenue was of Eastern Afghanistan, really.
Mhm.
So absolutely, it was an invasion. It was an invasion of somebody who was a Timurid who wanted to establish a Timurid state. It was an old-fashioned example of military imperialism. It was also an invasion of foreigners, of course, even more so of the Afghans. Of course, the Afghans had been in South Asia for centuries by this period of time. But he himself said that when he invaded India, he talks about himself as a foreigner. He said, we're foreigners, we didn't understand people's language and they didn't understand ours. And he said when he got to Agra, everybody ran for cover. I mean, people in Agra didn't know who he was or what he was doing there. And so his number of supporters, as I say, was very small, 7 or 8,000 troops. And so this was a desperately small group of people to try to control India. And gradually, of course, you begin to realize what a difficult problem it was.
Mhm.
Um, so absolutely, it was an old-fashioned example of military imperialism. And it was
Uh,
done because he was looking for a wealthy area to establish a Timurid state, period. That was it.
Okay, so you mentioned that Babur built three mosques, and one of which includes the Babri Masjid, which is sort of a point of contention in
Yeah.
India, right? So, what, from your perspective, what would you say, and how does the removal of Babri Masjid strip not only the Muslims but South Asians of their heritage?
Well, of course, it depends what civilizations you're talking about, I suppose, because I don't know what the Muslim population of India was in the early 16th century, but it was substantial. In fact, what's interesting about it, of course, is when he invaded India, after all, he found a Muslim population there. So unlike the Ghaznavids who invaded India in the end of the 10th and beginning of the 11th century, when there were almost no Muslims except in the areas that I used to work in Kerala. That's my early life and research in India was in Kerala. So probably the oldest Muslim community is down there in Kerala. But when Babur invaded India, there was already a Muslim infrastructure, you can say, in India. I mean, there was a Muslim society, there were mosques, there were imams, there were qadis, all of these things. So he didn't have to create an Islamic society. So from the point of view of Muslims, too, he was a foreigner. He didn't speak Hindustani, or I mean the language which people then talk about as Hindustani, this mixture of Urdu and Hindi. Certainly people didn't know Turkish. A lot of his own men were so unhappy in India, they picked up and went back to Afghanistan. They were so unhappy there. But in terms of the Hindus, like the Rajputs or others, absolutely there were foreigners, and yet another group of foreign invaders coming in. And but of course there's no sense of national identity, of course, in most societies, not only in India but elsewhere at this period of time. People identified by family or location or tribe. I mean, so the Rajputs were just as divided as other groups were. I mean, they fought among themselves as much as they fought against Babur. So as Babur tried to establish his control over these areas, I mean, the control was initially based, of course, on military victories. I mean, and the control that he established during the period of time that he was in India, which is only 7 years, was very minimal. It was a very shallow kind of control that he established there, as shown by the fact that Humayun was defeated and chased out of India of course, not by the Rajputs or by any Hindu group, but by the Afghans. But certainly, I mean, Babur was a foreigner. He felt that he was a foreigner. The Indians felt that he was a foreigner. There's no question about that.
Okay.
And so it was very difficult. If you read his memoirs, finally towards the end of his life, and then the memoirs of his daughter, who writes these very moving memoirs about her father, whom she only knew for about a year and a half.
Just that short of a time, because she talks about him. I mean,
yes, she got information from her mother and from the other women who were there. But she was only like 6 years old when she came with people from Kabul, and so she talks about him very movingly, from things that she witnessed. But most of the things she says about other aspects of her life, she must have gotten from her female relatives. But what's so evident by 1528, 1529, when he's carrying on these very long campaigns in the Ganges Valley, finally up to the borders of Bengal, it's very clear that he was exhausted and that he realized the difficulty of trying to subjugate a country. Trying to rule someplace like Central Asia, Afghanistan would usually mean gaining control of 2 or 3 cities, because most of the countryside is empty. But in India, trying to gain control over a territory like India, where there was a new town every 4 or 5 miles and a new fortress every 4 or 5 miles, and this enormous population, was extraordinarily difficult. And gradually, and very soon, of course, he began to realize what the problems were. And as you know, probably from reading his poetry, the poetry that he wrote towards the end of his life is all about why he wanted to go back to Kabul and back to his gardens in Kabul and to forget the whole thing. That is to say, not to forget the whole thing politically, but he really wanted to go back and rule India from Kabul. He didn't want to stay in Agra or Delhi.
It was hot and humid, and he didn't like it because it was hot and humid and dusty. And
he was sick so much of the time. If you read the memoirs in 1527, 1528, sometimes he'd be sick for 2 or 3 months. He'd be taking opium, trying to make himself, when he wasn't, and he pretty much stopped drinking by that time, but he was taking something else called Majun, right? He was, and the poetry that he writes towards the end of his life are poems. He writes a poem about why is it that, he said, why is it I'm so unhappy? He said, I coveted this land, but now I'm so unhappy here. You know, he was so unhappy there because everything about the land and society was so different from Afghanistan and Central Asia that he knew. So his criticisms of India were really criticisms of somebody who was terribly homesick.
Yeah.
No doubt the society was very different, but basically he was terribly homesick. You know? And
We'll be taking questions from the audience. I'm done with my questions, but
yes,
there's a lot of people who have asked a few things.
yes,
Someone
please.
asked, do we know if the Baburnama was written with the intent of dissemination, or was he just writing for himself?
No, it's clear that he was writing it for his family and probably for sons. One of the aspects of the Baburnama is an instruction text for his sons. For example, all of these details of Afghanistan and how and he has comments there about how you carry on military campaigns. He made one comment about his life in Central Asia, battles in Central Asia where the Mongols betrayed him, and he said it was his fault because of what he'd done to the Mongols in the past. And so there's a lot of what Muslims call nasihat, or letters of advice. So part of the Baburnama is that it's a kind of nasihat nama, that is to say, a treaty of advice and rules for how to run an empire for his sons. And he sent copies of it to his sons. And of course, it's written in Chagatai Turkish, so clearly it was intended for an audience of people who read Chagatai Turkish. It was not intended for an audience, probably not only of his sons, but people back in Central Asia. So absolutely, it was intended to be disseminated, yes.
Someone else has asked, did Babur and his descendants consider themselves as a continuation of the dynasty of Timur and not as a separate state? Is the notion of Babur establishing a new dynasty after Panipat historically incorrect?
Well, they certainly consider themselves as a continuation of the Timurids, yes. Of course, you have this really remarkable situation. I mean, from the point of view of the Timurids, I sometimes describe this as a Timurid renaissance. That is to say, it's the Timurids in a totally new social and cultural situation. And so what's striking about it, of course, when you get to somebody like Shah Jahan, the painting, you can see that the paintings that the Mughals did, in the paintings you see sometimes they showed themselves connected to Timur back. They'll have other Timurids in the paintings. Humayun, there's an early painting of Humayun that was done about 1555, 1554, 1555, something like that, which shows him and his immediate relatives, including these Timurids in Afghanistan and Central Asia. So there was always a sense of connection, and for many decades, many actually centuries, the Mughals sent money back to the shrines in Samarkand, to Naqshbandi Sufi shrines in Samarkand. And so they retained, and of course there was this attempt under Shah Jahan to retake the Timurid homelands in Samarkand. Their armies were sent into Afghanistan, and of course they never even crossed the river into Central Asia, but there was this sense of nostalgia, political nostalgia for their homeland in Samarkand. But of course, by that time, the Mughals had become so Indian that carrying on these campaigns in these cold climates was not something they enjoyed.
So last question is, was Babur's meeting with the Sikh Guru confirmed by any primary sources, or is the meeting a result of folklore?
The Sikh Guru.
I'm not sure which one they're talking about.
I'm trying to remember which Guru was at that time, but I do not think there's evidence for a meeting with the Sikh Guru. There's certainly plenty of evidence with meetings with Sufi groups and with the Rajput chieftains, but the Sikhs, I don't think there's any evidence of it. Yes.
Guru Nanak, the same person has said.
Guru Nanak, yes. Because he was in Lahore, of course, for a long period of time, and in the Punjab, I mean, between 1520 and 1525, I mean, there were a series of four or five expeditions in the Punjab, so he must have been very familiar with the Punjab. But I don't remember him ever talking about the Sikhs.
Okay.
Yeah.
So someone else has asked, how do modern day Uzbeks view Babur and Shebani Khan, especially given that Temur is now Uzbekistan's national symbol?
Yes, it's interesting the difference between, I mean, what happened in Ayodhya and what happens in Samarkand. In the Uzbeks, ironically, have absorbed Babur into their historical myth. And so the last time I was in Central Asia, I was taken around, I mean, in Andajan, which is Babur's hometown in the Fergana Valley. The state university is named after him. There is a mock shrine, which is there. There's a museum for him. And he is regarded as one of the great Uzbek heroes, despite the fact he hated the Uzbeks. Right? But the thing about the Uzbeks is when they became a nation state, when the Soviet Union collapsed, that they claimed everyone who had been anywhere near Central Asia at that time as part of their own background. So the Uzbeks love Babur and they love all of the Mughals, despite the fact that the Mughals hated them at the time. The difference, of course, is so different because then you have in Ayodhya, of course, Babur being denounced as this, often denounced as, for religious reasons, which I think is a mistake. You can denounce him for his imperialism, but not because he wanted to impose religion on the Hindus. But in Ayodhya or with the BJP, of course, you have people who have come to hate Babur, at least politically. And the difference in Central Asia is that he's regarded as this great Timurid hero. But I should say the other thing about him is that in the Western world, people don't pay attention to the politics in Central Asia or in India. They mainly look upon him as somebody who wrote this really extraordinary work, the extraordinary work that is his memoir, which is a more powerful and meaningful and rich autobiography than anything you can find in any other society. So in the West, as you probably know from studying in England or certainly in the United States, when people talk about Babur, they almost never talk about his military campaigns or the conquest of India. They almost always talk about the Baburnama.
Right. Because it's the only resource available or
Yeah.
probably the most authoritative one.
And it reveals someone who's a human being, and even more so with the poetry. If you combine his poetry that he wrote along with the Baburnama, it's even a richer source of a source which reveals him as, it reveals his humanity as someone who, for example, was in India, who regretted invading India, who was very unhappy there, who wanted to go back and sit with his friends and drink in Kabul, gardens in Kabul, and who was sick much of the time and really suffering, in a way, suffering personally in India, even while he was conquering these territories. So it's quite a remarkable story. And in any case, people's present interpretation depends on the political situation, I think. But in terms of his reputation as a human being, it's really remarkably interesting and rich source of information.
With that, I would like to conclude this session. Thank you so much, Professor Dale, for all your information and for enlightening all of us. It was an extremely enriching conversation, and thank you for doing this with me and for doing this with LLF as well.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a wonderful opportunity to talk to you.
I really enjoyed your book on Babur. It's very illuminating. And
There's
very,
also an earlier and more difficult version to read in which the poetry is discussed in much greater detail, but it's hard to get a hold of it. So,
okay. But
yeah.
thank you so much for being here and best of luck with everything.
Well, thank you. Same to you.
Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Goodbye.